Welcome to the 2021 Charles T. Daughter Lecture. My name is Eve Haskal. Title of this year's lecture is The Reluctant Cowboy, Moving Paths, Myths, and Dogma. It's been an absolutely terrible year. And this was a desolate picture I took on a mountaintop about an hour south of Charlottesville. I was hiking, it was cold and windy, probably only 2 people on that day. And it's been that kind of year where we have been separated from each other, emotionally stressed, isolated from our families. Most of us have lost friends or families as well. And on a professional level, 25 years of the Daughter Lecture means sitting in that giant hall surrounded by thousands of our colleagues, shoulder to shoulder, standing room only. The lights go dark, and an extraordinary speaker comes out, and something revealing and visionary pulls us all together. And instead, we're all separated, watching this on screens, alone. But I want to remind everybody what we've done as interventional radiologists, pulling together during this year, pulling protocols across the planet, trying to figure out how to manage in this plague year, or doing all those procedures. PD catheters at bedside, we hadn't done before. Dialysis catheters, gastrostomy catheters in acute or chronically ill patients. Arteriolysis for hypercoagulability or PE, or as in this case of this critically ill 18-year-old on ECMO with massive hemoptysis, bronchial artery embolization, no prior comorbidities. These are interventional radiologists. When diagnostic volumes cratered and people were furloughed and elective surgeries were cut, whether you're in a big metropolitan area, under a surge then or now, or in smaller hospitals hit by COVID patients, our volumes were maintained or went up, because that's what we've done as interventional radiologists, and we will be together again. But I want to pivot to what I'm talking about today, which is moving from being cowboys, which will always be, into people in support and in search of data. So why do we go into IR? And this is an excerpt from a column I wrote to inspire students years ago. It's that adrenaline thrill. Many or most of us remember that signal case, that excitement. It's like skydiving, of that uncontrolled hemoptysis and that embolic and that patient stopped bleeding. Or, for me, Penn's first stent graft, which I got instructions from Mike Dake remotely, which was to make a handmade Z-stent in the basement with a machinist and iron Cooley very soft graft and sew it on and put it into this young man's iliac artery through an 18 French sheath. I hadn't really thought about hemostasis. That leg is still fine and the stent graft is open. All of us have had those experiences, and those aren't going away. But the question is, how do we advance from being those cowboys into people in service and in search of data, becoming those clinical scientists? We'll always be like Professor Daughter on that mountaintop. And yes, that is my daughter. Next to daughter. We have to evolve from cowboys to legionnaires marching in service and collecting data. So I'm going to talk about the apodictic versus the apoplectic. And I give you this quote from this professor, scientist, and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead from 1933. Apart from blunt truth, our lives sink decadently amidst the perfumes of hints and suggestions. So what is the apodictic? It's knowledge that we are certain of. And what's the apoplectic? It's where we probably practice most of procedural medicine. You'll do it this way because I was trained this way, and therefore you'll be trained this way. Or it's the UCSF way, or the New York way, or the UVA way, or the Penn way. And it'll have to be that way. Why do we do this? Because it is so. Because I said so. Because it has always been so. And here's Leonardo's dinner. Thou shalt not puncture with INR greater than 1.5. Thou shalt not lay stent without IVUS. Thy biliary drain must follow failed ERCP, lest peritonitis ensue and sepsis. Filters are good. Filters are bad. Thy filter must live at the renal veins, lest clot form. Thou shalt vaccinate the spleen before laying waste to it with embolics. Lumbar drains must be placed before TVAR, lest paralysis ensue. Meta-analysis is beta-analysis. Thy intervention threshold is 50% or 15 millimeters or 10 or 5 or just pick something, whatever. Fibrinogen levels alone shall regulate safety of PE lysis. Thou shalt smite all AMLs greater than 4 centimeter at first sighting. Atherectomy is the path to purity of patency. Need I say more? And of course, P less than 0.05 is the divine test and declaration of truth. And Kevin Bacon shall be but 6 degrees of separation from us all. So who's sponsoring this dinner anyways? So I could spend the entire talk in 6-point font and just showing you lists and lists of these types of things, and you'd all recognize some of these and say, yeah, maybe, or no, I was past that one, or otherwise. And you're welcome to look at this afterwards and stop this at this point. But let's look at some specific examples to highlight the types of narrow vision that we have on a daily or on a field-wide basis. PAVMs less than 3 millimeters do not need to be embolized to prevent stroke. Really? Is a bacteria just too big to fit through a 3 millimeter PAVM? I mean, it's a 5 microns, a tenth the size of a cell. Where did that come from? No tool, no treat. You don't have a tool to embolize something smaller, must not be important to treat. That's what I thought for years, because Cook's smallest stainless steel coil was 3 millimeters, so you couldn't treat something smaller, must not be necessary. Actually, I learned from Scott Torretola that it goes even further back to a 1992 oral abstract presentation at the RSNA by Mel Rosenblatt, God rest his soul, 4 patients who had strokes where they measured the feeding artery 2.9 to 4.5 millimeters, to a tenth of a millimeter, and that's where this thing came from. It has been propagated repeatedly ever since. Pretty shaky ground for decision making. How about gallbladder catheters? They have to be transhepatic, otherwise bile peritonitis, when you take it out, transperitoneal, dangerous. Can't we get our arms around this question? Well, Professor Stan Cope, who I had the honor to work with for 8 years, actually wrote a paper on this demonstrating safety in '88. And Dr. McFarlane, the same in '94, CVR 1998, even 2010. Showing safety of transperitoneal approach. And if that wasn't ironic enough, I was recently asked by a plaintiff's lawyer to be a medical expert on a case in which there was an hepatic bleed, and she insisted that the interventional radiologist was negligent because they had gone through the liver and there was a bleed. How about tips? Can't make that 12 millimeter gradient, it must be a fail. Well, what are we actually measuring? We're measuring from atrium at the top to portal vein at the bottom, and have in every paper and every controlled trial. Where did the 12 come from? Came in part from this graph at the bottom by Drs. Garcia and Sao, which is a scatter plot. You can see the line drawn between that small number of data showing that esophageal variceal bleeders tended to be below 12 compared to ones that bled. That's the strength of the data. If that wasn't enough, they're measuring free to wedged pressure. And we're measuring atrium to portal vein. And there's always a gradient from free to atrium already built in of 3 to 4 millimeters. So we're already offset from their data. And why would 12 work for ascites, for ectopic varices, for everything else? Of course it doesn't. And if that wasn't enough, in China for decades, tips have been 8 millimeters, unexpandable stent grafts or stents, and they're doing fine. Why do we always get called in the middle of the night to do things? For lysis nephrostomies, someone else is putting double J's in during the day, and we're getting called at night. What are we, the IR urgent care? Well, we looked at this, and one of my partners, Dr. Contrello, reported this last year. We looked at UVA, an 800-bed hospital, a year of nephrostomies and 5 years of lysis. What time did we do these procedures? 84% of the nephrostomies between 8 in the morning and 8 at night, and 80% of the lysis between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. We're working during the day. Myth is busted. That's the frequency bias. Because you believe it's true, it reinforces your belief. It's actually called the Baader-Meinhof effect because of the German terrorist group that terrorized Europe. How about a metallic biliary stent? You put the stent in. When can you take the tube out? How long do you have to wait before removing the biliary catheter? 2, 3, 4, 6 weeks? It was answered 30 years ago by Professor Adam in one of the first wall stent papers in which nearly all the catheters either came out immediately after the procedure, at its end, or the next day. We've known this. Here's an example of the danger of reading light compared to in-depth. It's an excellently written prospective multi-center trial under the auspices of the FDA, approval trial for a vena cava filter. I published it as the editor in JVIR. Everything's laid out. Here are the conclusions from the abstract. This is what we read. At 60 days, at 2 months and 1 year, no cases of PE. Pretty good. You'd want that device. Here's what happens if you read inside. A third of the patients were purely prophylactic. That means they had no DVT or PE to begin with mixed in. That's like taking people who have cancer and are treated and people who might get cancer, a third of them, and following for a year and saying, look, we didn't have cancer. But you put those people in. Papers are this long for a reason. We've got to read in detail. Another example, PICC lines rarely cause DVT. It's safe. Millions placed. Look inside of this paper by Professor Itkin, in which they were randomizing 2 types of catheters to somehow detect a difference from that little difference of shape in the hub. They screened 6,000 patients to randomize about 139 in each arm, and no, there was no difference in the outcomes because of that little shape. But what they did do was do methodical ultrasounds of arms with PICC lines in place that nobody had done before. And this is what's inside the paper. 70 and 73%, that's 3 out of 4 patients have DVTs identifiable around the PICC. In other words, virtually every PICC causes a DVT. Reading carefully. How about this old saw about having to inject into the wire hub? Otherwise, your attendees are going to yell at you because, as a colleague of mine calls them, suck bubbles are going to be drawn into the microcatheter and into that patient's brain or wherever. Well, we ran this experiment at UVA repeatedly with clear and colored water, and you can get bubbles by injecting into the hub with the wire, without the wire, but most importantly, if you carefully fill the hub, regardless of the wire, no bubbles. There is no suction into the front. It's just about filling the hub. It's another IR, pants on fire. Sometimes the system creates a narrow perspective, the regulatory system. 30 years of data showing that a thiodol, a tumoricidal oil that kills HCC, especially when you densely accumulate it within it, is an important agent, dating back to Dr. Matsui's work, and suddenly we had drug-eluting embolics and oil disappeared. Who asked why? Did a regulatory constraint drive us to simply accept a complete at-face value pivot away from oil? Well, in the US, oil is not on label for HCC. It's lymphangiograms and histosalpingograms, which means you couldn't include it in a trial with the embolics because that would require an IND for the drug as well from a different company. So it simply got dropped and we said, okay. If you think about it, actually, TACE in general is a completely heterogeneous therapy that we somehow talk as if it's monolithic, and it's important to remember this in every single TACE paper that we read, whether it's conventional TACE or classic TACE or micro TACE or super TACE or TACE plus, TAE, extra TACE, super high octane, low calorie TACE with oil and doxo and gel foam and mitomycin and triple drug and oil or no oil or permanent. Anything that you want, and there's never been a report of consistent oil preparations and endless numbing societal meeting workshops on how I do TACE, which just tells you that this is cowboy art rather than uniform science, advancing it, allowing us to make decisions. Oh, and by the way, where did triple drug TACE go? For decades, we talked about adriamycin, mitomycin, and cisplatin had to be the modus operandi, and then it disappeared. Look at where it came from. It came from a 1990 paper by Dr. Vanook, an oncologist at UCSF. I knew him when I was a fellow there. And this is what he wrote in this 1990 JCO paper. I quote you directly. It was based on unpublished pilot experience of Aigné et al. personal communication, February 1986, who found the treatment to be active and well tolerated in a few patients. That was the scientific basis of decades of insisting on this from the podium. And then suddenly it disappeared. And why did it disappear? Because we lost cisplatin for a while. So we simply forgot about it. We've got to do better than that. Sometimes our own specialty echo chamber creates these myths that we then reinforce, like on our messaging boards, as is an active conversation now. Common femoral artery, branches, good place for surgeons to operate. They're great at it. We shouldn't touch it. It's an easy operation to do an endarterectomy. Guess what? Look at the published surgical data, and anywhere from 8 to 18% serious complications and clear-cut higher risk groups in obese patients, diabetics, steroid use, where this is the last thing that somebody wants to do. And if that wasn't enough, there are plenty of papers in endovascular, surgical, and cardiology journals describing peripheral interventions, endovascular ones, in that exact space, regardless of what we're saying. And if that wasn't enough, they're published in JVIR as well, in over 500 patients, but we're still talking about it on boards as if it's somehow a don't touch area. This is a form of medical tribalism, like Sheth wrote in JVR 2020, the natural tendency of like-minded individuals to create social groups and separate themselves from other groups and just reinforce. Can't get out of our comfort zone. Now, sometimes we use it in the reverse. Sometimes we use that effect to talk to other tribes, like saying that aortic endografts for trauma, arch replacements, were going to be bridges, and all those young patients were going to eventually have open replacements of the aorta. We never thought that was going to be the case. That was simply to get that off the ground. And it's the same with TIPS. It's for bridge to transplantation, when in fact it's never been, because most people never get livers and were simply treated complications of portal hypertension. It's the expert halo. It must be so because the experts say so. So this is what it means to take the meta view and speak perhaps to another tribe. And I'll show you a paper from 1966 by Professor Stanley Baum, the great chair at Penn and my first academic chief. When he was at Mass General, having an arteriogram was the most dangerous thing that you could have done. You're going to have an arteriogram. We're going to lay down the black curtains and call all the family. So what they did was they looked at the results and the ordering of 1,600 arteriograms. And they looked at what happened to people who had arteriograms and what happened to those who had them ordered but canceled within 2 days. And major and life-threatening and lethal complications in the ones who had it ordered but didn't have it as well. It's the hazards of non-angiography as well. It's all about that tribal perspective. So I was reading this interesting article about Heidi Julavitz in the New York Times about what she learned in Avalanche School, which I thought was particularly topical because we've had one of the worst years in decades with avalanche deaths across U.S. states. And this is not about what happens when you're buried, because you're basically dead, because the snow turns into concrete, and if you're lucky, you die within 15 minutes of CO2 narcosis. But it's more about how do you get there. It's the consistency bias. It's heuristics. Every moment you don't turn around for home, it gets harder and harder. Keep going up that slope. Or the commitment bias, our tendency to remain committed to our past behaviors, whether it's what we've continued to do, or maybe our partners did beforehand, or the expert halo. The experts must know what they're talking about, so it's safe and it's okay to follow them. Doesn't this sound like interventional radiology? I mean, why do skydivers with 2,500 jumps die? And that's me actually. I'd been out of the sport for 2 years, so I did a recurrency jump. I retrained. I went out with a coach. He happened to have a helmet cam on, some very simple maneuvers, spin around, make contact, demonstrate altitude awareness, and then break off, wave off, fly, separation, and sign off. So here I am, separating out and reaching for my parachute. 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, 4, 1,000, 5, 1,000, 6, 1,000, 7. That's about 1,400 feet of drop. I've had a major main parachute malfunction that in 140 prior jumps, I'd never actually trained for, except that morning they had trained me for this specific thing. So I knew exactly what to do. And when I landed, I was actually angry at the rigger. because he had made a mistake rather than anything else. By the way, my reserve parachute is orange. I had never seen it before. It's difficult to remain constantly situationally aware about what we're doing with that patient or the data and the background behind it. But it's imperative. Well, surely meta-analysis of the path to truth, because you go up to the top, you're at the top of the pyramid, the guru is there. And look at the number of meta-analyses that are growing. If this were a stock, this is the new GameStop. And so many of them coming from China. Why? Because you can take everybody else's data and pull it together and write a paper and get published. So it must be good. And what is it? It's the analysis of the analysis. It's integration and power. It's rigor over narrative. It's signal over noise. It's the Superman. You want that on a shirt. You want to be that. And here's what you can do with the meta-analysis. 95 trials that had to be pulled together to show that neutropenic cancer patients had lower mortality with antibiotics. And even large individual trials were not enough to pull it together. Life-altering signal. Guess what? One analysis of 7,200 systematic reviews. Take out the Cochrane analyses. 1/4, 27% had low risk of bias compared to 87% of Cochrane analysis. That means that 3 out of 4 meta-analysis, garbage in, garbage out, can't be trusted. Remember this 1981 New England Journal paper in the New York Times? More than half of pancreatic cancers might be attributable to coffee. It took us years of subsequent trial trying to elucidate signal that actually suggested that it might be coffee dose and it might actually have a protective effect in men. Still don't know about in women. Or if you want something ripped from the current headlines, 2 major papers retracted now with COVID data that continue to be cited by subsequent papers regardless, that haven't identified, that have been missed by editors and reviewers. You have to stay vigilant as a reader. So you got to have a mental checklist when reading and know what we can do or what we can't do. And obviously I can't teach you this now, but you can stop the slide, have to learn about bias, have to know how you can analyze what is statistical data, when is it just a hammer to squeeze something out for a publication. Well, certainly an RCT solves it all. No, it's another echo chamber. Half of this, half of that, they're all the same. Must just be the signal, everything's perfect. Great paper by Professor Ioannidis. Looked at 49 highly cited papers, papers that have the highest academic ranking because other papers have included them in their bibliographies hundreds of times. 45 of them showing that what they tested was positive. Look at the effect of this study. And then what happened afterwards? 16% of them contradicted by other studies. 16% of them different effects. Only 44% of them replicated. More than a third of top-cited RCTs in a 5-year period have similarly been affected. And if it's not an RCT, it's even less likely to be tested because people don't replicate small trials. They tend to replicate big ones. Here's a good example of great scientific journalism that I go back to every 1 or 2 years by Jonah Lehrer in the New Yorker, 2010. The truth wears off. Why is it that signal becomes less as people retest things again and again? Things aren't consistently reproducible. Happens all the time. Part of it is because initially investigators have that positive bias and they design the trial to show positivity. We also still have a bias against publishing negative results. So we have to accept in our DNA that it's iteration, reiteration, renewal, replication, evolution of results. There is no perfect gold standard in clinical research. An RCT does not end it all. A meta-analysis may not solve it. And against our IR natures, we have to have ongoing skepticism and constrained exuberance, not going at that latest shiny new object. Each study is a door to another variant, essential and warranted. But we have to be thinking about larger questions than this, Copernican inversion questions, in which the sun no longer rotates around the Earth. And look at the power of sizes and scale and data, like the SELECT trial that randomized 35,000 men to show us that vitamin E was going to reduce our prostate cancer risk, but it showed the exact opposite. Or the Women's Health Initiative trial, 16,000 women randomized, that showed that postmenopausal hormones in healthy women did not outweigh the risk. Or 18,000 in Dr. Topol's collected analysis that took COX-2 inhibitors off the market completely for cardiovascular risk. And think about how our own specialty world has been rocked upside down for several years with a single meta-analysis of just 4,000 with drug-coated balloons. Because we've never seen numbers like 4,000. And every paper with 200 tries to flip that. We have to think bigger. But at the same time, we can't think too small in terms of daily management and information. IR knowledge is not atomic. It's complex. You can't live with, I read the abstract, or I cruised the conclusion, or I spoke to the rep, or I heard there was a podcast, or I smelled the drama on Sir Connect, or I chatted over it with a salad, or I saw the tweet. We can't turn into that. We can't crowdsource data and decision-making through social media. But if we look at JVIR as one way to see where our literature is involved and evolved, you can look at this in detail in my exit column in December 2020. I've published these heat maps before, and what it shows is the intensity of research and citation on what we do as interventional radiology in our specialty. And on the top, we're doing research on a lot of different things. That's why there are all these colors separated, and each one is a term of research. But in the last 5 years, we have these two intense areas and a lot of cited and recited and repeated oncologic research. And a surrogate for quality are these terms that I looked at over this 14-year period: prospective, randomized, population health, registries, meta-analysis, their appearance in the journal. The number of times that we use these words in our papers grew by 42 to 2,000%. We're getting better. So I give you a call to arms now. I wrote about this in 2016. We have new trainees now entering the specialty, and we have 5 years in which we have to inculcate them methodically in this type of thinking, daily, and also research, reading, and preparation. And this is going to require a fundamental and intentional mutation in training DNA, like a centralized CRISPR insert into each program, because we can't expect that each program is going to have the ability to teach this. We need to develop this nationally and make it available to our trainees and across the planet, because this is our long game. So back to that opening column. And here's the first sentence. There's never been a better time to become interventional radiologists. But the truth is, for those of us in the specialty for long, it's always been great. It's been different, but it's always been great all along. And we're always going to have that Professor Daughter spirit, like he is there on that rock face. That cowboy aspect is always going to be there. But we have to embrace the next evolution. And I give you a quote from 1968 to the American College of Surgery by Dr. Daughter. If my fellow angiographers prove unwilling or unable to accept or secure for their patients the clinical responsibilities attendant on transluminal angioplasty, they will become high-priced plumbers, facing forfeiture of territorial rights based solely on imaging equipment others can obtain and skill still others can learn. We've lived through that, but we equally have to create our data and our own science. That's the next step. So what do we do? On a personal level, embrace this constant self-query and self-reflection and skepticism and patience, and read in detail and embrace the dialectic. And on a local level, cheer on developing prospective research. 5 to 10 times the effort to write protocols, but durable and impactful, and may be built upon or linked to other work. And on a national level, support initiatives for data that can be congregated through standardized reporting, through Vertex registries, through NIH efforts, and open your pocketbooks with patronage for these efforts as well. And on the big blue planet, think about the large-scale questions that we can put together with other groups. We have to mine the facts for truth and work daily to be clinical scientists. So when I was coming down that hike that I showed you that picture of, there were probably only 2 people on the mountain that day. And it was cold and I was tired. I've been training for Rainier with a heavy pack. And I came across this by the side. Somebody in the interim had written into the snow the word hope, which I found very inspiring. And I hope that you feel that too with me. And I share you this quote with from Socrates, which is, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Or, if you prefer a more recent poet, one that I love, E.E. Cummings, "Always the beautiful answer who asks a more beautiful question." And so with that, I am out of here. Thank you very much.